Got some new Shroud of Turin stuff for you today. I know that's a popular topic for sure, so don't go away. I'll be right back. Well, hey there, Gracious Gang. It's Mike from the graciousguest.org, Gracious Guest YouTube channel, Gracious Guest podcast, everything Gracious Guest. Here with you today to bring you some more great content. In this case, we're going back to the Shroud of Turin. We never get tired of taking a look at the Shroud and seeing all sorts of new interesting stuff and different angles on it. So before we get into that, though, I would ask, as always, please make sure you subscribe to this YouTube channel. If you're listening to the podcast, make sure you bookmark that, save that, subscribe to that over there, whatever the case is. Like this content if you could. Give us a good review, good rating. You can do ratings and stuff on Spotify, I think, now. So if you're listening to the podcast version of it, that's because you found us probably on any podcast aggregator, iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, or whatever. I know there's ones that might not exist anymore that I'm even on. So anywhere you get podcasts, you can get the Gracious Guest podcast. If you sometimes like to listen to this or follow our stuff here that I'm doing on the channel, but you can't watch the video or you can't do YouTube at that particular moment, just doesn't work for you, never fear. You've got the audio version. That's really where this thing began. The YouTube stuff came about later on. So I just encourage you, share this content far and wide. Really appreciate it, and gets the word spread. Some great spiritually enriching stuff on here. So we're all about trying to become gracious guests in this life, in this world, in this beautiful creation God has given us. A world that is so often filled with the drama of fighting against sin and spiritual warfare, that sometimes we forget that it didn't start that way, right? That sin enters the story later than creation, or later than God's act of creation. And so sometimes we have this false sense that it's just all bad, right? It's all bad news. And sometimes it seems that way. But the fact is, there is good news, and the good news is greater than anything we could possibly imagine. That our Lord has given us this deeper, richer, more incredible, eternal focus that we're all supposed to do our best and respond to His grace to say, focused on the ultimate joy and infinite perfection, the still point of perfected beings it's sometimes been called, right? That heaven ultimately is. And so along the way, He gives us like the lembas bread, right? A lembas in Lord of the Rings, way bread, this ultimately the Eucharist, of course, in this life, but He gives us little snippets of what's to come, little hints, little you could say small case S, even sacramental windows into the greater reality and joy and beauty that He's trying to lead us to. And one of those ways that I think is increasingly, it seems, on our channel here, a little window into eternity, into the joy to come, into a deeper meaning of life, is the Shroud. The Shroud of Turin, what it communicates to us about the suffering of Christ and the redemption on the other side of that suffering, which He then promises to us. And as you've seen on this channel before, we've had a lot of guests on to talk about the Shroud, and we can't, strictly speaking, scientifically prove, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that this is the burial shroud of Jesus. By the same token, there is a tremendous amount of evidence to support that it is. There is evidence to the contrary that is pointed to. There's evidence on both sides, and we need to do the best we can to evaluate it and see what where the truth seems to be leading. Now, it's no surprise to you, probably, if you've seen this content before, that I firmly believe that it really seems to be the Shroud of Jesus. And that has developed over time, and it's largely developed because of the work of people like my guest today, Guy Powell. And let me just share this. This is from Guy's website here, which everything's linked below. Guy R. Powell is a marketer, part-time historian, Christian, and author of the new historical fiction, The Only Witness, A History of the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin is the most valuable yet controversial relic, with theories and science proving and disproving its validity as the true burial cloth of Jesus Christ. Powell builds a compelling history of the burial cloth, beginning with its witness to the most significant event in human history, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Powell's history then describes how the shroud travels from Golgotha in Jerusalem to Odessa, Constantinople, France, and finally Turin, Italy. If you're interested in a Christian story intertwined with a possible history of the shroud, then this story, The Only Witness, will be of special interest to you. Guy is also the host of a terrific podcast on the Shroud called Backstory of the Shroud of Turin. It's been coming out for the last couple months at the time of this recording, and he's got some great interviews on there, some interviews with some big names in the Shroud community to be sure. So again, check out the links below. Check out all of Guy's work. He's doing some awesome stuff out there. Stand by for the release of his amazing historical novel, and I was so excited to talk to him, and as you'll see here, we really got into some details about that work that I think you'll really find intriguing. So without further ado, let's jump in to my interview with Guy Powell about the Shroud and his new book. Check it out. All right, Guy Powell, thank you for being my gracious guest on the Gracious Guest Show.
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here, Mike.
Well, and as listeners to this show on our audio version and viewers, of course, on the YouTube version are no doubt aware by this point, the Shroud of Turin has become unexpected. By the way, for me, I didn't set out to do this. It's become a very recurring topic, and so we've spoken before with different folks that have different experience with the Shroud, and that's where I really wanted to basically start with you. Just maybe tell us a little bit about your own background with the Shroud specifically, and how you your interest got piqued.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's kind of in 1978, and I hate to say it, that goes back pretty far, but that was when the first kind of real scientific study of the Shroud took place, and you may have heard of it, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, otherwise known as
Right.
STURP. And I remember that taking place, and I remember, wow, that's kind of interesting. The burial cloth of Jesus Christ, and it has some kind of an image on it, and didn't really think about it too much after that. And then in 1988, the infamous radiocarbon dating came
Right.
out, and it's basically debunked the shroud. And I said, oh well, I guess it wasn't, it was a fake,
Yeah.
and kind of gave up on it. And then I kind of remember, and all of these they're memories, but they're very very well faded. And then in
Sure.
1998, I think it is 97 maybe, is when the fire in Turin took place, and that was when the chapel burned, and they rescued it, and that made the news. And I go,
Hmm.
oh, I thought that was fake, and I
Right.
wonder why they kept it, and why are they still worried about it? And then my brother and I were talking, and he and I went on a trip down to Florida, and we ended up talking about the Shroud. And he says, "Guy, I've got a really good book for you to read." And he sent me a book from Ian Wilson. It's called The Blood in the
Okay.
Shroud. And I started reading it, and I don't know, I'm weird. It's really kind of a history text. And what I
Hmm.
mean by that is it kind of says, okay, in 19 or 18, 55 this happened, in 1856 this happened,
Right.
and it was
Right.
kind
Right.
of, very factual. And
Yeah.
I said, man, this is really interesting. And I didn't realize there was that much history behind it. And all these little facts kept coming out of it. And I said, oh, so, maybe the shroud is real. And so then I started, after I read that, I said, wow, this does make sense. And I said, but this is no way to tell the story of the shroud. Nobody's going to read this, unless you're weird like me. Nobody's really going to read this. And I said, what would be interesting is if somebody wrote this as kind of a historical fiction.
Hmm.
And I was sitting there, and then one weekend I said, I'm just going to go ahead and write. I had an idea, one of these flashes, and I started writing basically the first story that's in my book now.
Hmm.
And I hate to say it, that might be 15 years ago.
Oh
And
wow. Yeah.
so I wrote that, and then life got in the way, and I really wanted to get back to it, and I had other books and my business, and
Hmm.
and the kids and this and that, and I never really got back to it. But I really wanted to, and then finally, I hate to say it, then COVID happened. And so then all of a sudden I said, well, now I've got time to to write my book, and
Right.
I spent I spent every weekend just writing my book, and I
Well,
did all of that, and then I realized as I was writing the book and going through the history and looking at all of the uh, I wouldn't necessarily call them facts. They're probably circumstantial evidence, which are
hmm
very, very close to being facts. And then that got me to really starting to think about it as being the wow. This if this is true, then the shroud must be true. If this is true, then the
right.
shroud must be true. And then of course, then I continue to write my book and brought out a lot of those facts and even talked about, of course, the radiocarbon dating
Sure.
as being then
Sure.
now I think it's been pretty well debunked.
Well, and that's I wanted to ask you about just and we're going to come back to the book and the podcast as well here in a little bit. But what is it for you? I mean, like as you've learned more about the shroud, are there? I'm sure there's a lot of things, but what would you say are a couple of maybe the highlights or the key sort of aspects about the shroud that kind of convince you personally of its authenticity?
Well, um, first of all, I guess it's either authentic or it's not. And if
Right.
it's not, the most popular theory is that it was a an artistic forgery done in maybe the 1300s or so. And
Sure.
one of the things is that there's a couple of, and if you think about what the arguments are of the anti-Shroudists, I'll call them, and
hmm
not to be derogatory, because they have their own
Right.
convictions, and I
Right.
hate to say it, they might be right. I mean, there's no way to prove one way or
Sure.
the other. I kind of think they're wrong. Of course, they think they're right.
hmm
But nevertheless, so they point to the first date of the history of the shroud, so the written history where there's really direct evidence of it, as
hmm
opposed to the rest of the evidence before that is more kind of circumstantial. And even though if you look at the whole story, then you say, yes, this definitely is a fact. It was written, but it doesn't necessarily say the shroud. It says a cloth or it says something else.
Right.
And so they're all kind of circumstantial. And if you put them all together, then it kind of makes sense prior to 1300. Now,
hmm
in 1300, in the 1300, 1400s, 14th century, 1300s, there was a bishop that said, no, that shroud that you're talking about is a forgery, stop showing it.
hmm
And he then petitioned the Pope, and one of the popes said, yes, you're right. And then another pope said, no, you're wrong. And if you don't stop complaining about it, then I'm going to excommunicate you. And so then and this is Bishop Darcis out of Troyes in France, and he then had to stop. Basically, so you have one pope and you have this bishop saying, no, it's fake. The anti-Shroudists really believe that. The Shroudists, like myself, then we look at everything else and we use that as as saying, well, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence. There's enough here to to make it think like it's real. Now, I mentioned the radiocarbon dating. Then the anti-Shroudists will certainly point to that and say, no, the shroud was scientifically dated to the to 1260 to 1390 in that range there, and it just
Sure.
happens to be coincident with the timing of when this Bishop Darcis was also talking about it.
Okay. Well, and I was just looking too because it looks like and I have not read the book yet. When do you anticipate its wide release here at the time of
Well,
this recording?
I, when you're writing a book, and this is my first historical fiction, I've
hmm
written a bunch of other marketing books,
Right.
and so there's two ways to go. I can either self-publish or I can get a publisher. I've got
Right.
it with two publishers right now, and depending upon how they do it, and I would rather go
I
with a
see.
publisher, then they'll probably be 6 months out. If I
Okay.
go with a self-published, then I'm about 2 months out. So it's the
Gotcha.
book itself is more or less done. The big difference is that they would want to do a complete edit on it, another whole go
Right.
around on it, which it's worth it. There's no question about it that
hmm
anytime you have an editor, a professional editor on a book, it always gets better. So then
Sure.
those are kind of the options on the timing of it.
Sure. And I'm sure, and just at the time of this recording, this is we're right in the middle of May 2022. So anyone watching this later, it might already be out. But we'll
Yeah.
definitely I'll do some internal, like in my own network and everything, promotion, that sort of thing. When it goes live, so to speak. So, but with the what I was noticing though is the write up on it. It looks like you've got is the forward by Joe Marino. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right.
So I've
Yeah.
had some at the time of this recording, I haven't had him on yet, but I have plans to have Joe on to really just take us on this journey. In fact, you might even see back on the shelf, I've got that giant, the what is it, the 1988 C14 dating debunked
Yeah.
book. So I'm working my way through that. It's a tome. I mean, it's massive. So
Yes.
what was your reaction when you dug in a little bit more and heard some of it, and it gets very hyper specific. Some of us are not as scientifically minded as others, but what was your own sort of impression of hearing that kind of onion peeled back, or seeing that sort of situation of like, wow, like you said, with the fire, what did that journey kind of look like for you, as far as hearing some of this other evidence about the potential issues with the carbon dating?
Well, yeah, and I read that book as well, and I hate to say it, I kind of liked it. But you're right, it is a tome, and but that's very factual. Okay, so it's
Mm-hmm.
this fact, this fact, this fact, this fact, and I like what he did is he presents various facts, and then he gives kind of some commentary and various facts
Sure.
and commentary. And as I was reading that, I realized how much politics were involved
Mm.
in the radiocarbon dating. And there's kind of, you think about the politics here in the U.S., where you got the Republicans and the Democrats, and they're just constantly fighting, and the politics with the international church or the global church
Mm-hmm.
and religion, and then of course you had the politics between the scientists. It's kind of like at a whole new level.
Yeah.
And when you
It doesn't
read
seem
his
it
book,
seems unavoidable.
yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, and when you read his book, you realize how much politics was in there. So there was the personal politics of the labs trying to get their name in light, so to speak, as being,
Mm.
we're the ones that tested the most important Christian artifact, and we found it to be a forgery, and therefore you need to pay us a lot of money to use our dating method.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was those kind of politics going on, as opposed to really trying to do the dating absolutely correctly. And when you read the
Mm-hmm.
book, you'll see that they didn't follow any of the procedure. They had an agreed upon
Yeah.
procedure. There were 5 or 6 major steps, and every one of them were done against that procedure. They didn't follow it whatsoever.
And again, I'm still working through it, but as I understand the short version of it, that the test itself was, as far as those protocols, well, to me, one of the most significant ones on the surface seems to be breaching the protocol about, that samples were to be taken from multiple portions of the shroud in order to try to get at a specifically avoiding any potential contamination from just one spot. But it looks like they were all taken from one spot, a spot that is largely, seemingly, I think, been, I hesitate to maybe use the word proven because I don't know yet, but from what I've seen, very suspect because of potential repair patch, or those kinds of and some other more sophisticated stuff I understand that might have factored into it.
Yeah,
Um,
you're right. There's about 4 things that are wrong with that.
yeah.
One of them is that it is most likely been a repair. And
Hmm.
if you look at the coloring in that corner, you see that the coloring changes, and it looks like the corner had been scorched. And
Okay.
so then, if that's the case, then that might mean there might have been not only the repair, but the scorch, which means more carbon, which means then potentially a way to contaminate the sample that they took. There's
Sure.
also potentially a watermark that either during that fire or previously, most likely previously, there was a watermark that stretches into the corner. And then lastly, that is where, and even on this picture here, you probably can't see the details, but that's one of
Hmm.
the extensions in 1611. It's where they're actually showing the
Right.
shroud, and
Is
you'll
that the
see
crowd?
that
Like everyone's holding it
and you'll see the
or
bishops
touching
are
it? Yeah.
holding it by that corner. And
Yeah.
and then Lastly, and I guess this is a fifth dimension, Ray Rogers and there was another scientist as well. He found in that area, he found gum and he found dye.
Hmm.
And the gum is there. Linen apparently doesn't take well to hold on to the dye, so you put gum on it and a sticky gum, and I guess it dries in some fashion to hold the
Hmm.
dye in it. And then what's also happened now is that and you can see pictures of the samples that were not used in the radiocarbon dating but are still with the labs, and you can
Hmm.
see that they have this gum on it, and you can see
Hmm.
that they didn't properly clean the cloth. You would have had to clean it with hydrochloric acid, and they didn't do that because then this guy, Ray Rogers, a chemist, he then said, this is what a fiber, a linen fiber, would look like had it been properly cleaned. And you can see
Hmm.
nice and clear, almost
Right.
clear, versus what they had, which was relatively dark. And
Hmm.
so, that's another reason why then that corner, from as a sample perspective, either wasn't treated properly, so it wasn't cleaned. It was from a bad place because it might have been contaminated. And then one of the protocols that they were supposed to actually follow, which was in Joe Marino's book, is that they were supposed to take, I think it was 5 or 6 samples from different locations,
Right.
and
Right.
so that you would mitigate the chance that you had a bad sample for whatever reason it was.
Sure. Sure. Huh. So, there, needless to say, and then again, like I said, we're probably going to go into a lot more depth in the episode eventually with Joe here before too long on those particulars. But I want to turn back to your book here for a second and think like the history of this. And I've seen some of. I don't have it right handy with me, but I have my stack somewhere of the British Turin Shroud Society, um, their newsletter that they put out quite a bit. There's some writings from Ian Wilson and those, and David Rolfe and others in the Shroud community who have a pretty big presence in there. And I think you interviewed. Did you interview Brenda? I think recently,
I
or Brenda
did.
Benton. So that's yeah. So we have we've had some common friends in the community there across the pond, so to speak. But one thing
Yes.
I found very intriguing was some of Ian's writings in there in the last year or two, where he was talking about. I guess he's working behind the scenes, on some new stuff, and just trying to kind of continue to look at new evidence. And so it's in fluctuation, right? Like we don't know for certain. We know that the current cloth in Turin, we have an unbroken chain of custody on that going back centuries, but there's a point when beyond that, like you said, behind that we
Yep.
don't know for certain where was this cloth, and so that's the thing skeptics bring up, where they're saying, okay, so now you point to this shroud that's referenced, sounds very similar, in Constantinople a couple hundred years before that. We can't perfectly prove right now, obviously, that those are the same cloth, but there's a lot of good arguments. And then there's as I understand it, this other shroud, in Odessa, long before that, And so, how did you go about, in coming up with this sort of vision, this project, setting your sort of plot line, so to speak, for this particular historical fiction?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I did follow Ian Wilson.
Hmm.
There are other paths that some of the other researchers think it might have happened.
Sure.
So, obviously, the shroud itself, was probably present on Golgotha. And the reason why I say probably is that some people believe the shroud was used to transport Jesus' body over to the tomb. Um,
Hmm.
and the tomb is so close to where Golgotha is that, it was either there, to transport him, or it wasn't there to transport him, was brought,
Right.
though, with him over to the tomb. So then it goes from the tomb, and this is then all from the Gospels, and so it's in the tomb, and then
And I'm sorry to interrupt, Guy, but just to correct me if I'm wrong, but would that, if that's true, the transporting the body, would that not be a good piece of evidence of why, for example, like there's these matches right between the Sidarium and the shroud, where if his face was wrapped and they carry him then in the shroud to then anoint him, why you would have, but then they set the face cloth to the side, you'd have those matching blood flows and those kinds of things. Is that correct? Or what the
well,
theory is? Part of it, at least.
Well, there's two theories there.
Okay.
Some theories are that he was carried in the shroud from Golgotha over to the tomb. Personally, I don't think that's the case.
Okay.
And the reason for that is because if he was carried, if you're going to carry a 175, 180-pound man in a cloth, he would be, shifting around and there'd be all kinds of smudges on the cloth.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So there are no smudges. And
Right.
so because of that, most likely then the cloth was laid out first, his body was placed on it, and then his
Gotcha.
body was covered by it.
Okay.
So from that perspective, then where the face cloth meets Jesus is potentially the face cloth was over his face and wrapped around his face in some fashion, at Golgotha, and then it was brought over to the tomb, and then I guess it was taken away. And Jewish burial custom is you don't want to take anything with blood on it away
Right.
from the body. You want to make sure that it stays with the body, and then it would be
Right.
buried with the body, so to speak. And then
Okay.
those two blood types match, and also then the blood pattern kind of matches some of the blood
I see.
patterns on the shroud.
So it's not that it would match because of them being both on him on the same time, but in relatively close time sequence. You have this face cloth, then that's taken
Yep.
off, then the shroud's put on him, but all of those wounds and the blood's still maybe still flowing a little bit because he's buried very quickly, to try to get him buried that night. So that's why those wounds would all match because they're coming from the same face
Yeah.
within
Yep.
probably a few minutes or maybe an hour or two or whatever the case is. Okay, that makes sense.
Yep. Yep. Exactly. So, and now the interesting thing is, when he was taken down, it was shortly before 3 o'clock. It's believed, and Passover is about to begin, so they have to be done with the burial at 3 o'clock. So they really don't have too much time. And then there's other Jewish burial customs depending as to whether they clean the body or not, and it's not clear to me exactly what happens. So
Right.
now, so that's right there is where my book starts.
Gotcha.
Is where did the cloth come from? And so Joseph of Arimathea, it's claimed in the Bible that he bought the cloth somehow. So I have a little story of a boy, 12, 13 years old. He's given money more or less by Joseph of Arimathea to go out and buy a cloth because, hey, we need one. You got to go get it right now because Jesus is going to be on the cross and we need a burial cloth. And so he runs around and
Wow.
tries to get a cloth, and I have a good story. Well, I think it's a good story with him
Hmm.
running around trying to find it, and then I mix in all of the historical kind of things that he might have run into when he's running around the
Okay.
city of Jerusalem during Passover. And
Wow.
really, the one I think is the best one, and it's hard to believe, but one is there's a profession. Typically, it would have been a slave, but they would get paid. They would get paid more than a Roman soldier, and their profession is a sewer scraper. And so they have
Wow.
to go into the sewage, and they have to scrape the sewage out, and so and he gets
No,
paid for it.
thank you.
Yeah, exactly. No, thank you. Well, I have the
Oh
sewer
my.
scraper coming out from where the bathrooms are, and of course there's public bathrooms, and they have to smell, and there's flies and whatever. And I have him running into the guy and going, "Oh my God, what?" And anyway, that's one of the stories. And
Oh
so
my.
trying to bring to life the history at the time
Yeah.
with the actions that are taking place, that we know
Sure.
about.
Well,
And
and let me just ask you kind of as part of that too, because and we're gonna get the bigger picture here too. But I just want to throw this in with those kinds of details. So you said like you follow Ian Wilson's particular kind of framework for the overall journey of the Shroud. But I always wonder because I do some historical fiction on the side too, and I'm always just curious as I try to grow at that. What kinds of resources and that sort of thing do you draw upon, or do you kind of go to try to fill in those things, those more specific cultural and historical tidbits?
well, I've become a fan of Wikipedia, certainly, and but I mean, when I wrote my first book, the internet was just barely starting, and you couldn't quite do the research.
Right.
Now, I mean, you can find everything on Wikipedia. I mean, not on the internet. Wikipedia is
Yeah.
kind of a good directional, and then you can go to other
Right.
sources then to get to corroborate the supposed facts there.
Sure.
And so that's kind of how I did that. And then I also
Okay.
hired a historian. He's a grad historian, and he did a lot of the research on a lot of the different things. And
Oh, cool. Okay.
one of the other things I think is really interesting is, Jesus is fed either vinegar or sour wine or whatever,
Hmm.
when he's on the cross on the hyssop branch. And one of the things that is interesting is that back in that time, you don't drink water. So when
Mm.
we read it, we go, why is he drinking this sour vinegar? Why would anybody give somebody sour vinegar?
Mm.
Well, you don't give anybody water because the water is contaminated. It'll make you sick. It'll give you
Mm.
dysentery or whatever. So they would decontaminate it with either vinegar or a strong
Mm.
wine to kill all the germs. And
Oh,
so
wow.
there's two things that are interesting there. One is all of the Roman soldiers are drunk all the time because,
Mm.
they're men, they like to drink. And then, of course, you can't drink the water, so you have to drink the wine.
Mm.
The other thing is that this concoction of whatever it is, vinegar and water, then is something that everybody would drink. And the most popular wines at that time were very, very sour. And
Mm.
so then, most likely that's then what was going on when he was given the vinegar on the hyssop branch, when he was on the cross there.
I think I remember that they really focus in. I know in the Passion of the Christ, they really focus on those Roman soldiers just being out of it, and it makes you wonder if it made it a little easier to do some of that brutal stuff that they did,
Oh,
just kind of. But yeah, oh my gosh. So
yeah.
back to I wanted to ask you about that, but as far as the ongoing journey here of the shroud,
Yeah.
so
Okay.
how do you kind of follow the history in general of it from there?
Yeah, so and there's pieces where, the good news is fiction you can kind of make up where you don't have facts, and you can
Sure.
kind of, based on, some different things, you can kind of come up with something. Some people have it that that Peter had the cloth. I have it as Joseph of Arimathea got the cloth, and he has it for a handful of years and then gives it back to Peter, and Peter's in Jerusalem. Then at some point, I have the cloth going from Jerusalem up to Edessa.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the other historical shroud researchers have it going to Antioch in Syria,
Right. Right.
and it could have gone there, and I could have written another story where it goes to Antioch and then over to Edessa, but at some point there's agreement is, maybe overstated, but let's say 50% of the people think that at some point the cloth was in Edessa.
Mm-hmm.
Then I have it in Edessa, and Edessa is two things. One is you have kind of an ongoing war between the Roman Empire and the Sassanid or the Persian Empire,
Mm-hmm.
and Edessa is right there on the frontier. And
Okay.
so then you have then the Sassanids trying to expand their empire, and then you have the Romans trying to
Right.
defend. And Edessa being right there, then they kind of use the cloth as a way to protect the city. And so they would
Mm-hmm.
march it around the walls and things like that to protect the city. So I have a story on that as well. So I have a story as to how it gets from more or less Jerusalem up to Edessa, and then I
Mm.
have the warring going on between the Sassanids and then the Romans in Edessa, and then I have it going secretly from Edessa to Constantinople because at some point it ends up at Constantinople, and just about everybody agrees that during the Fourth Crusade, the Shroud of Turin was in Edessa. Now,
Mm.
there's a handful of other facts in during that time. There's coins that were made. There's
Right.
an Epicrator image. There's a couple of other things that kind of give you some feel that it was most likely in these places, or
Sure.
an artist, of some kind went there and went to and saw the shroud face to face and was able to draw a picture of it and things like that.
I've heard some recent stuff I want to look more into. So yeah, just this is just in the last week or two. Different speculation that it's possibly after the First Crusade, but before the fourth, well, not the fourth, actually, even earlier than that, but for after the first crusade, that you have, I guess, between that and the second crusade. I want to say I'm a little rusty on that. My crusades professor, my undergrad, would kick me right now for forgetting the actual, but I know you had upwards of 100-year period, not quite, it was about 80 years or so, where you had, Jerusalem, for better or for worse, like not all the Crusaders were, of course, doing things that they should have been doing, but you did have this period of relative a peace, or just sort of a Christian kingdom, in Jerusalem, and that there are some theories, some evidence that people point to that suggest that perhaps it was brought back to Jerusalem. It's interesting to me because when you think about it, if you don't know that it's all going to fall apart again and you're going to lose Jerusalem again, and you're living at a time when Jerusalem has been conquered and now it's this Christian city, and you have every hope that it's going to stay that way. I mean, why wouldn't you, bring it back to where it was? And so that's an interesting possibility, but it sounds like, so you went with more of it staying. I think the prevailing theory is that it probably stayed in
Yeah.
Constantinople,
Well, but
because
if
that
you
was still
were,
the seat of imperial power, of course, too.
yeah, yeah. Well, and that's just it. If you were the
Right,
emperor and
right.
you
The
had
emperor
possession
wants
of
it.
this, you are not going to give it up. I mean, you are
Hmm.
going to own that, and you are not going to, you're going to be very careful about it. And
Right, right.
so I mean, it may have done that. I hadn't heard that theory at all, but and I think though because of the the imperial politics and obviously the
Hmm.
religious politics at the time, I don't. It would be hard for me to believe that the emperor would take it anywhere other than leaving it in a and keeping it
Yeah.
very well guarded and stuff like that.
I wouldn't if I were him. If that's
Yeah,
if
yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah.
if that's
Although,
evidence, I don't know.
there was kind of interesting in the 700s. There was iconoclasm, and so
Right.
then all the icons were hidden, and
Hmm.
so the shroud as being the icon of Jesus that was also hidden, and so it's possible that that he the emperor would say, hey, listen, I don't want this thing. It's we don't want the we're iconoclast. We don't want that. So let's get rid of it. So it's possible that they moved it out of there.
Yeah.
I don't know. I doubt it, but it's certainly possible.
Well, how do you, and with the Constantinople possibility, though, I'm just curious because I've wondered about this myself. And again, I don't. I should say, I'm certainly at no point asking you to give away any spoilers on the story or anything like that. So please don't do that necessarily. But I'm just wondering if there's anything you can share or want to share about, or just your thoughts on how it gets from Constantinople to Lyre. And I mean, it seems to make sense from documentaries I've seen. That it wouldn't have been Guy de Charny, right? Or who's the Crusader
Often Belarus.
ancestor? Okay, yeah. But you know, I'm kind of clear with this idea of, you've got French Crusaders in Constantinople, then you have this mysterious shroud show up in this Crusader family. It makes sense in general, but I'm just wondering how, what you'd be comfortable sharing about how
Yeah,
you sort
no,
of
absolutely.
envision how it gets from A to B.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I have so in 1204 is the Fourth Crusade. There's a guy Robert de Clary that has heard about the shroud, then sees it in the what is believed to be the Blaschanet Saint Mary Blaschanet Church,
Hmm.
and then Othon de la Roche is he's like one of the top three or four guys in the Crusades. He's
Right.
French. He is from Reni, France, and I'm
Hmm.
probably not saying it right, but anyway, Reni, France. And so he's there in the Crusades in Constantinople, and he takes it.
Mm.
And what happened at the end of the Fourth Crusade is that Constantinople was just raped and pillaged of everything.
Yeah. Yep.
And the Pope said, if you are caught with different things from Constantinople, I will excommunicate you.
Right.
So if Othon de la Roche took it, and then he would say, "Uh-oh, I'm not going to show anybody. I'm going to hide it, and
Right.
because I don't want to be excommunicated." So now he is then he goes over to Athens and becomes the Duke of Athens, and he really he's there for about 20-25 years,
Mm.
but then he goes home, and then so he leaves from Athens, and I have him going by ship. He could have gone by land, of
Sure.
course. I have him going by ship and then entering in Marseille and then up through France, and then avoiding the
Sorry, could you say that again? My apologies.
sorry about that. So I
No
have him
worries.
going. from
We
I
have
have him
another
going
guest. No,
from yeah, Siri's interested in the
yeah,
story as
series.
well. So I have him going from Marseille up to Rini and avoiding the I think it's the Fifth Crusade in southern France with the Cathars.
Okay.
So then he
Well,
now has
and just a quick side note for those, I was just thinking for those who might not be up to speed on Crusade history as much. With the Fourth Crusade that we were talking about in Constantinople. I mean, Constantinople is this gem of Eastern Christianity. There are Christian brothers and sisters, and these, you have this horrible, just there's no way around it. This tragic, unforgivable, not saying unforgivable, God can forgive anything, but if we repent of it, but this travesty of an event where Christian knights from Western Europe, like you said, you just rape and pillage and steal, just they get bored on the way to the east, whatever the case is, and they say, hey, this city's great, let's wreck this one. So I'm shortening it, but there's a couple
yeah
good books I'm going to recommend in the comments, on the Fourth Crusade specifically, that really kind of, I think, give you a good background on that. But that's, of course, we're talking about of these, French Christian knights potentially taking this icon that's this Christian heritage for all of us, but it's in Constantinople, and they potentially seize it, so. But
yeah
but
and
God in His providence, what might have happened by the same token to that shroud if it had stayed there is an interesting question as well. So
yeah
sorry,
and
but yeah, I just wanted to mention that.
no, 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 and I appreciate that. Because the fun part about writing the book was really investigating all these different things and the politics, the wars, and the different factions and what have you, and just going back to the Fourth Crusade. One of the things you had was Christians fighting Christians, and here you are, in one of my stories as well as one of the guys that is the aide to Robert de Clary. He's going, why are we fighting Christians? We should be fighting the Muslims. Why aren't we going to Jerusalem so that we
Yep.
can accomplish what we were originally conscripted to do? And so anyway, yeah, and you're right. There's the Fourth Crusade. I never knew how important it was, but it was definitely important. And really, the Fourth Crusade was the end of the Roman Empire in Byzantium, Constantinople, because the rape and pillage took so much, and then the politics afterward. It took another couple of hundred years for the Roman Empire to die at that point, but nevertheless, that was really the end of the Roman
Yep.
Empire.
Yep. Because they
So
weren't able, after, as subsequent centuries, they weren't able to ultimately withstand the rise of the different sieges of, ultimately
yep,
the Ottomans and
yep,
right. So yeah,
yep,
and now
and the
modern
Muslims coming in, and
Istanbul, right, that we're talking about, that was Constantinople
yep,
for so long. So Byzantium, right?
yep, yep,
Yep.
exactly. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so then Othon de la Roche, he takes it with him up to Rigny, France, and he has it hidden because he doesn't want to get excommunicated, and then it falls into the hands of his children and then grandchildren and whatever, and one of those is Geoffrey de Charny. He is one of the great knights. He wrote a book on chivalry. He was a carrier of the Order de Flamme, which is the flag of the French Empire. And there's a whole other story in there which I don't even go into, but interesting stuff nevertheless. And so he ends up having it. It gets, goes to then his children and grandchildren, et cetera, et cetera. 3 or 4 centuries, 3 or 4 generations later, Margaret de Charny comes into the picture. Now, Geoffrey de Charny actually had a church built in Liry, France, and he gives the church, he gives the shroud to the church.
Okay.
And the question is whether he gave it to him or whether he loaned it to him.
Oh, okay.
Now, at the same time, you
It's
also
always an
have the
important
100 years.
distinction.
Yeah. Well, it is important because then Margaret de Charny says, no, 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 that's my shroud. I'm coming to get it. And so she then actually takes it from the Leary church, and I have a story that it's because they want to protect it from the marauders, for the English marauders from the Hundred Years' War,
Oh,
and
okay.
so she has to come and protect it. She takes it. The Leary canons, the ones that run the church, they go, wait a minute now, you know, I'm going to tell the Pope on you, and then she actually gets excommunicated.
Oh, okay.
And then it's the excommunication of her that then for her to for her to get rid of the excommunication, she has to, when she dies, will it to the Duke of Savoy. And then
Ah,
that's how the
okay.
Duke of Savoy gets it. He then takes it to Chambéry, France, and
Yep.
then because of the wars between France and Italy, or France and Savoy, and Chambéry is kind of on the border, he moves it further away from the border to Turin, and that's how it got into Turin.
Okay. I just heard, I don't know, I have to look into this more, but I heard somewhere, I was reading an article that I think at least part of, or there's a theory at least, or I don't know how formally true this is, but that Charles Borromeo, apparently at the end of his life, I don't know but from what I heard, that, he wasn't able to make it the whole way to make this pilgrimage to see the shroud, and they brought it to Turin because it was closer. So I don't know if that, but that was a beautiful, if it's true, a beautiful honoring of him. What a great saint who gave his life really in spending himself to help victims of the plague and that kind of thing. So
Yep, yep,
but
absolutely.
there's
So
so
there's
many
a story.
stories, right?
Yeah. So I have
Yeah.
a story with Cardinal Borromeo,
Oh,
and
okay.
and he is after and there's always been plagues, we know that
Right.
now,
Yep.
and
Yep.
it's possible or probable that the plague that they had was also a follow on from the Justinian plague, and it's kind of interesting if you think about how COVID works. It kind of works over here, and then we all get infected and we live, or we get immunized and we live, and then somehow it goes over there and
Mm-hmm.
it evolves, and then over there, and then it comes back. And so most likely that's kind of what was going on with the Justinian plague for hundreds
Sure.
of years. And so it ravaged all of Europe. Now Cardinal Borromeo was in Milan, and he didn't get sick. And he was then he said the reason why we were able to save Milan from total devastation. I mean, still, only like 25% of the population survived.
Mm.
And he then said it was because of the Turin Shroud.
Wow.
And so then he said, once he declared that the plague was done in Milan, he says, I am going to march on foot from Milan up to Chambéry, France. And then, to your point, the Duke of Savoy, Emmanuel Philippe, I think it was the second, he said, no, 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 don't do that. I'm going to move it to Turin. Just come to Turin. It's a
Hmm.
couple of days walk as opposed to a month walk up to Chambéry.
Yeah.
And so that's
Wow.
then what happened. And he would be like these exhibitions. He was at one or two of these exhibitions, like this ostension that I've got
Oh, well,
here.
that's what I was going to ask, because if it wasn't being held in Turin yet, I was curious about what the connection was. So had there been an exposition of it in response to like the plague or something, or what was his? I didn't catch that
That was
detail.
kind of what he was thinking. The
Okay.
Turin Shroud, well, or the Shroud before it was the Turin
Yeah.
Shroud, was being shown quite a bit, and
Okay.
hundreds and hundreds of times. And then that's why the corners and then the top
Right.
side would have been contaminated, and also potentially, in need of repair, just because it was handled so many times.
So that
And
was so
so
he was
he was
attributing
very
the
familiar
divine
with it.
protection just to the sort of miracle of the shroud sort of
Yep.
itself, and he wanted to go, okay, pay his respects, kind of. Okay. Huh.
Yeah, yeah,
Interesting.
yeah, exactly. And there's a
Gotcha.
story as well with Andrew Casper. He'd be a great interviewee as well,
Hmm.
where Cardinal Borromeo, when the first time he sees the shroud, he gets on his knees and he's praying to it for hours and hours, and just
Hmm.
kind of a fascinating story in terms of how the shroud affected him when he first saw it.
Wow. Oh, well, I'll tell you what. Well, Guy, we're kind of getting close to the end of the time we had set aside here, and I just want to make sure I give you a minute or so if there's. I mean, this is just delightful. I'm really excited. You're building some anticipation here for sure for this read, and I can't wait to get a copy. But is there anything else? I know you have a podcast as well. I've got everything linked below here for anyone listening or watching. Anything else you want to share, just as far as key takeaway, or what you, maybe for the book and for the podcast maybe as well, what you really hope? I had the question I think I shared with you I wanted to end with. What do you hope the impact is for people from all of this work you've been doing?
Well, and I think the first and most important is that I bring one person to Christ. That's
Hmm.
all.
Amen.
that is my goal. If I can bring one person, I will have succeeded, and I'd be happy. Now, obviously, I'd love to have more, bring more people to Christ for it. And it's kind
Yeah,
of one of the reasons why I wrote the book the way I did, is because I wanted it to be something that a non-Christian could read, something that they'd find just as interesting as as any other novel. They could
sure.
read it and say, "Wow, that's interesting. I never knew about the shroud. Let me
Right.
learn more." And then
Look into this
hopefully,
more. Yep.
in doing that, then bring non-Christians over to over to Christ,
Sure.
and realizing that there is a lot more to the story than just the shroud itself. There's a handful of very interesting references to faith, and then there's always a handful of references to the Book of Ruth.
Mm-hmm.
There's all kinds of things that from the Gospels, and other books as well. So
Great.
so there's a little bit. It's not heavily weighted with lots of quotes or things out of the Bible, but there's just enough in there to realize that yes, the Bible has meaning to everybody's lives, regardless of
Right.
what century you live in.
Yeah.
And so yeah, one person. That's all I want is one person.
Oh well, I think if our Lord has shown anything, it's that he's if we give him even just a little bit, he can do stuff we can't imagine.
Yes.
You're definitely in my prayers for this, and I'm excited to see where it goes. But thank you so much for coming on. Like I said, I'll get links to you here below for anyone wants to learn more,
Great.
and just about you and your other work. But yeah, God bless you. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much, Mike. I really appreciate it, and it's always fun to talk about it, and really appreciate the time.
Yeah, yeah. Amen. Hey, take care.
Thank you. Amen.
And what a delight indeed that was. And again, I can't wait to read the book myself. I've got my advanced copy, sort of a draft of it to sort of check out, which he's graciously shared. So I'm going to be digging through that, and I can't wait. So, like I said, in the future, at the time of this recording, now this may be past when you're watching this, but if you're watching this and the book is not yet out, if you're in that window here in the next few weeks or months until it officially hits the shelves, I will do a follow-up just to give you an update on that, or pass that information along so that you can kind of be aware of where to get it when it's available. If it's available already, you'll see it down in the show notes, because I'll go back and add that link to this at that time as well, so you can get that once it goes officially out into circulation. So God bless you all. Thank you so much for tuning into the Gracious Guest Show today. For more content like this, stay tuned, subscribe, make sure you share this far and wide. And until next time, whatever you do, don't forget to wonder. Take care.